Well, today is the first week of our brand new message series for the fall. And so I'm really excited about it, but I'm also excited for another reason. We're also kicking off a new preaching season that will begin today and run all the way through early June. And all of the messages in that season, we've got some incredible series for you coming up, but all of those messages will revolve around our annual theme that we're calling Get Together. Get together. We want to take some time this year to look at our lives in connection with other people. You know, the global pandemic we've been living with over the last 6 months has not only physically separated people, but has created a mental disconnect as well. We've become disconnected from friends, extended family members, coworkers, teachers and students, and even members of our faith communities. Zoom has been great, of course, but it can never satisfy our deep-seated need for human compassion and for companionship. The physical detachment required of sheltering in place for months on end has finally taken its toll on our mental and physical health. Rates of loneliness, depression, and anxiety have skyrocketed in our world. And worse yet, we have come to see other people as potential carriers of a deadly disease and therefore a hostile threat. This will not last forever, of course, but it will have a lasting effect on our collective psyche. So now, more than ever, we need hope for a brighter future, for that great day when all this is really over and we can all get together again. But it's going to take some hard work to get there. And ironically, to get together, we actually need to start by looking at what separates us, at our differences. And that's why we're calling this new 6-week message series that we're starting today, we're calling it Not in My Backyard. Because we really need to take a critical look at what divides us before we can begin to reconnect and grow closer again. The premise of this series is that we tend to hold people at a distance because they appear to be different from us in some way. The most glaring of these differences, which has captured the national attention recently, is of course race. But there are many other ostensible differences among people that also seem to worm their way into our psychology and keep us apart from one another. Differences in socioeconomic class, ethnicity, gender, mental and physical disability, sexual orientation, and immigration status, to name just a few. And all of these distinctions become embedded in our social consciousness, fracturing humanity into various tribes and resulting in prejudice and discrimination. But the night before he died, Jesus prayed that all his disciples would be one. He prayed the world would truly know that God had sent him because his disciples would be brought to perfection as one. In other words, Jesus' mission on earth is inseparable from the unity of humankind, and to the extent we remain divided, his mission has failed. That's why we're doing this series. It's an effort to break down barriers and maybe, just maybe, find some common ground. Now, that may seem overly optimistic to you, probably even Pollyannish, because there's a lot of obstacles in our way. We lack clarity, for one thing, on the meaning of terms like racism and ableism or homophobia and xenophobia. It's hard to talk about something when you can't even agree on what to call it. We also don't know how to talk about our differences, especially in mixed company. We don't know what to say and often end up tripping over ourselves precisely because we're afraid of appearing insensitive, intolerant, or ignorant. But even more fundamentally, we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to talk about core issues of racial and other forms of social injustice because then we'd actually have to make some difficult changes. We'd rather paper over the problem with colorless statements like, let's all get along and just be nice to each other. So the obvious question at this point is, why even do this series? Why bother? Perhaps the obstacles are insurmountable. Maybe it will just stir up more trouble, divide people further, and create unnecessary controversy. In the end, perhaps no one will be happy, because for some, the series will go too far, and for others, not nearly far enough. But I'm willing to take that chance, because we really need to talk about this. Years ago, I attended a school in Atlanta. It was a seminary that served several different Christian denominations. I was getting my feet wet, you might say, taking a few night classes in theology while I was working full-time in business. And I'll never forget, one afternoon in the cafeteria, people were chatting, and they were enjoying a few snacks between classes. And a white woman suddenly stood up in the middle of the room and yelled out, "Could I have everyone's attention, please?" Well, the room fell silent. And then she proceeded to point out that the tables in the cafeteria were being occupied by racially homogeneous groups. Black students were eating with other black students. White students were gathered with other white students. And the self-imposed segregation that she had abruptly called our attention to suddenly became painfully obvious. "Let's all get up right now," she said enthusiastically, "and let's switch tables, let's mix it up." She insisted that we move from our tables on the spot so that some of the white students were sitting with black students at every table. She wanted a more racially integrated lunchroom. The crowd stared at her, wide-eyed and open-jawed, with a mixture of disbelief and fear. And after a few awkward moments, the conversation gradually resumed, and no one moved. Not one person. For so long, we have lived in a society deeply separated by race and other arbitrary divisions. Over the years, you and I have witnessed race riots on television, demonstrations and counter-demonstrations, repeated calls for justice, and even tragedies like the one in Charlottesville, North Carolina a few years ago. And little has changed. No one has switched seats. It is only now, at this moment, that I personally believe we are witnessing the start of a sea change and the early stages of a fundamental course correction. There is a growing awareness of these issues that I'm starting to believe will finally become permanent. A growing unwillingness to remain at our segregated tables is sweeping the country, and that's why we should pay attention to this message series. Because it will result in our personal growth and ultimately in greater peace and understanding so that someday we may all be one, just as Jesus prayed. We need to have a mature conversation about race and other social constructs that separate us. So, we'd like to suggest some ground rules for you to consider during this 6-week series. First of all, we all need to acknowledge at the outset, and we need to accept, that we will be emotional about this. Discussions about race and other differences often are marked by tension, anxiety, fear, anger, and confusion. We're afraid of not being heard or being blamed. We're worried about the changes an honest conversation could demand. We might feel defensive about injustices that we did not directly create. We could feel embarrassed or ashamed by the terrible history of human degradation and victimization others have suffered. Anger may surface for those who have been wounded by the injustice and scarred by the inequality these divisions have engendered. But the simple understanding that these feelings are normal and are likely to surface in the conversation is a good place to start. That's the first ground rule. The second ground rule is that there is no place for ad hominem attacks or cheap shots based on the personal qualities of the people we disagree with. And in the same way, the third ground rule is that we have to avoid a careless misattribution of motives to other people, because it's just destructive. We can't say things like, "You're only saying that because you're a white male," or "because you're a socialist." Those statements aren't helpful, even though they may be true. We should instead assume goodwill and pure motives from our discussion partners. And then the last ground rule is that difficult conversations require real listening. Instead of anticipating objections, exploiting strategic advantages, and crafting rhetorical flourishes to prove our point, we just need to take time to listen without judgment and avoid knee-jerk reactions. If we can do all of that, we just might be able to make some progress and come to greater understanding together. Now, so far, we've been putting a lot of hedges around this series. I've been issuing disclaimers and setting some ground rules. You might be thinking that it doesn't sound like it's going to be much fun. Confronting racism, sexism, and other forms of prejudice is challenging work. It is painful to look at ourselves through a microscope, but this series will be thought-provoking, and more importantly, it will be hopeful. Because the goal of all of this, in the end, is reconciliation and forgiveness. If there is any contribution the Christian faith can make to the dissension that is happening in our world today, it is the knowledge that God demands we reconcile and forgive one another. Forgive your neighbor's injustice, God says in the Bible. Wrath and anger are hateful things. Set enmity aside. Think of the commandments. Hate not your neighbor. Remember the Most High and His covenant, and overlook faults. We heard that in the first reading. In fact, God's mercy towards us is predicated on our willingness to be merciful to others. The vengeful will suffer the Lord's vengeance, the first reading told us. Could anyone nourish anger against another and expect healing from the Lord? No. Could anyone refuse mercy to someone else and seek pardon for his own sins? No. To illustrate this truth, Jesus told a parable about a king who demanded payment from a servant who owed him a tremendous amount of money. And begging for mercy because he could not repay the money, the king decided to forgive the entire debt out of mercy. But then that servant, he went and he found another man who owed him a much lesser amount, and he demanded payment. And that man begged for mercy, just like the servant had, saying, "Give me time, I'll pay it back." But the servant refused to forgive the debt and threw the man into debtor's prison. And when the king heard about the affair, he was furious. "You wicked servant," he said, "I forgave you your entire debt because you begged me to. Should you not have had pity on your fellow servant as I had pity on you?" Then, in anger, his master handed him over to the torturers until he should pay back the whole debt. And then Jesus says, "So will my heavenly Father do to you, unless each of you forgives your brother from your heart." If we want forgiveness from God, we must forgive. And we must forgive an infinite number of times, or as Jesus puts it in the gospel, 77 times, which in all practicality is beyond counting. But here's the thing. Any real forgiveness first requires some sort of an apology. Listen to what Jesus says in Luke chapter 17, verses 3 to 4. He says, "If your brother sins, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him. And if he wrongs you 7 times in one day and returns to you 7 times saying, I am sorry, you should forgive him. For there to be any hope of reconciliation for racial and other forms of oppression, there has to be some sort of an apology, a real admission of responsibility, and a willingness to be held accountable for the injustice. And the problem is that those of us benefiting from society's oppressive structures are often unaware of the problem. White people, for instance, including me, rarely, if ever, think about their race. We are taught not to have a racial viewpoint, right? To perceive ourselves as white is to be biased. We were taught, right? And to be biased is wrong, right? So we try not to think about race. And we therefore become highly fragile in conversations about race. In her New York Times bestseller, Robin DiAngelo calls this white fragility. The problem is, the more we deny any involvement or any benefit from systemic injustice, the more we perpetuate it, because then we're not expending any energy in learning about the problem, building relationships, or undertaking anti-racist practices. My first year in seminary, when I was studying for the priesthood, I was sitting with a group of students one afternoon. I was brand new. It was probably my second week in. And this group of students that I was sitting with, they were complaining about the fact that the Vietnamese, Filipino, and Latino seminarians had banded together and had petitioned the administration to set quotas on the ethnic composition of the student council. And since each of those groups, the Vietnamese, Latino, and Filipino seminarians, comprised about 30% of the student population, they wanted proportionate representation on the council. And the seminarians at my table just could not understand this mindset. Why do they make everything about ethnicity and race, they grumbled. Focusing on our differences only divides us, they argued. The seminary should be colorblind, they all agreed. It was then that I realized the other students I was sitting with were all white, like me. This is the defensiveness, denial, and unwillingness to admit that race is a relevant category in our national consciousness. To admit that we do not yet live in a post-racial world, and to admit that we have not yet reached the racial promised land. And that denial, that defensiveness, that mindset prevents real progress, because to the degree we think we have arrived, none of our energy will go into doing what we need to do to begin the process of reconciliation. Today, I admit to you that I am a white, straight, able-bodied male from the southern region of the United States, an area wounded by the historical institution of slavery. I admit that at the age of 7, I was traumatized by a group of black children who threw rocks at my brother and me when we rode our bicycles unawares through their segregated neighborhood, and that this incident has probably affected my outlook on race somehow. I admit that I grew up in an upper middle class, white neighborhood and attended nearly all white private schools, and that in those years I heard many racial and ethnic jokes, and although I never repeated them, I said nothing and did nothing to stop them. I admit that I am the son of a Swedish immigrant and am proud of my Scandinavian heritage. I admit that I grew up worshiping a white Jesus and that I currently am a member of a Eurocentric religious institution that I am proud of for having clearly denounced racism and other unjust practices, but am equally ashamed of for having allowed it in the pews for so long and not going far enough in condemning it. I admit, therefore, that I am not and can never be completely neutral and wholly enlightened when it comes to race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, immigration status, disability, and other human characteristics that have the power to divide us. None of this makes me a bad person. it makes me human. My hope is that in this series, you will be able to make some similar admissions for yourselves. Because if you can, you and I will be able to take a significant step forward in working for a more just society. In the words of Father Brian Massingale, a pioneer in the area of racial justice, the central message of Catholic Christian faith is this: the wounds are real and deep, but healing is possible.